2:17 a.m. on November 8, 1944, Private First Class Eugene Kowalski pressed himself into a rotting oak log in the Hürtgen Forest, 600 yards behind German lines. The log was 4 feet in diameter, hollowed by decades of decay, barely large enough for a man and his rifle. Kowalski had carved firing ports into the soft wood with his trench knife. His battalion commander had explicitly forbidden this exact tactic 3 weeks earlier, called it suicidal individualism, that violated sound infantry doctrine. In the next 11 hours, Kowalski would kill 52 German soldiers from that log. In the next 3 weeks, his forbidden method would spread through 3 divisions and fundamentally change how the U.S. Army fought in dense forest. The German MG-42 team was setting up 30 yards from his log. Kowalski could hear their boots crunching frozen leaves. He could hear them speaking something about coffee, something about the cold. The machine gun's tripod scraped against rock. Through the 2-inch firing port he'd cut at ground level, he could see their legs. The lead gunner wore non-regulation boots, probably taken from a dead American. Kowalski's Springfield was loaded with armor-piercing rounds he'd traded cigarettes for. His orders were to observe and report. His training was to maintain position and await reinforcement. His instinct, developed in 3 months of watching men die in these woods, was to do neither. He'd been in the log for 6 hours. He'd urinated into an empty ration tin without moving from position. His legs had gone numb below the knees. The rotting wood smelled like wet earth and fungus. Small insects crawled across his hands. He'd learned not to react. The MG-42 team finished their setup. They were oriented south, toward the American lines Kowalski had left the previous evening. They expected attack from that direction. Everyone expected attack from that direction. That was the problem. Kowalski had grown up in the lumber camps of northern Michigan. His father had worked the saw lines. Kowalski had spent childhood summers learning which trees were hollow, which were solid, how rot progressed through oak versus pine. He knew that a sufficiently decayed hardwood log became a natural bunker, dense enough to stop small arms fire, hollow enough for concealment. He knew that soldiers looked up for snipers, looked forward for assault, almost never looked down at the forest floor. He'd proposed the tactic to Captain Hendricks after watching his squad get cut apart by an MG-42 they never saw. Hendricks had called it cowboy nonsense. Had said battles were won by coordinated fire and maneuver, not individual heroics. Had specifically ordered Kowalski to stop talking about it. The German gunner settled behind his weapon. His loader fed the ammunition belt. Through his firing port, Kowalski had a perfect angle on both men's torsos. He controlled his breathing. The Springfield safety clicked off, a sound softer than a branch breaking. The Germans didn't hear it. Nobody heard it. That was the other part of the method nobody understood. A rifle shot from ground level, muffled by surrounding earth and deadfall, sounded nothing like a shot from standing height. It sounded like something falling. Maybe an artillery dud. Maybe nothing at all. He fired. The gunner collapsed forward onto his weapon. The loader spun, confused, scanning the treeline 20 feet above where Kowalski actually was. Kowalski had already worked the bolt. He fired again. The loader fell. 2 other Germans appeared from a foxhole Kowalski hadn't seen. They were shouting, pointing south toward the American lines. They thought the shots came from there. One raised binoculars. Kowalski shot him through the chest. The other dove for cover behind a tree. Kowalski waited. 30 seconds. 40. The German broke from cover, running perpendicular to Kowalski's position. Kowalski led him by 2 feet and fired. The German sprawled forward and didn't move. 4 Germans dead. Nobody knew where the shots originated. That was when Kowalski understood the full potential of what he'd discovered. Eugene Kowalski was born in 1921 in Stevenson, Michigan, population 847. His father, Joseph, had immigrated from Poland in 1903 and found work at the Stevenson Lumber Company. The family lived in company housing, 3 rooms for 6 people. Eugene was the second son. His older brother, Victor, died in a sawmill accident in 1935, crushed when a timber chain snapped. Eugene was 14. He quit school the next day and took Victor's position on the sorting line. The work was 12 hours, 6 days a week, sorting logs by quality and species. Oak, maple, pine, birch. Solid, compromised, hollow, rotted. You learned to judge by sound, by smell, by the way your boot heel felt when you kicked the bark. He learned something else in those years. He learned that hollowed logs were discarded, burned, considered waste. But hollow didn't mean weak. A 6-foot oak log hollowed by carpenter ants or fungal rot retained its outer shell. That shell was often harder than the interior had been, compressed and densified by years of weight and weather. You could stack 3 solid logs on a hollow one and it wouldn't collapse. You could drive a truck over certain hollow logs and they'd support the weight. The lumber bosses didn't care. Hollow meant reduced board feet, reduced profit. So they burned them. Kowalski registered for the draft in October 1940. He was inducted in March 1942. Basic training at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. He qualified expert rifleman, scoring 198 out of 200 possible points. His drill instructor noted in his file, superior marksman, poor team player, tendency toward independent action. That assessment followed him to the 28th Infantry Division, where he joined Company B, 110th Infantry Regiment, in July 1943. The division deployed to England in October. They trained for the Normandy invasion. Kowalski was named designated marksman for his squad, which meant he carried the Springfield instead of the standard M1 Garand. It meant he was expected to take longer shots. It meant his squad leader, Staff Sergeant Raymond Tully, watched him constantly for signs of cowboy behavior. They landed at Omaha Beach on July 22, 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day. By then the bocage fighting was already chewing through rifle companies. Kowalski's first combat was outside St. Lo. His squad was tasked with clearing a hedgerow defended by a single German machine gun. The MG-42 had interlocking fire with 2 other positions. Standard doctrine was to suppress with rifle fire while a bar team flanked. Tully ordered exactly that. The bar team got 30 yards before the gunner cut them down. Private First Class Eddie Bianchi from Philadelphia. Private Michael Russo from Brooklyn. Both died in an irrigation ditch, hit multiple times before they could return fire. Kowalski had been watching from behind an overturned farm cart. He'd seen the MG-42's muzzle flash. He'd traced the angle back to a position inside the hedgerow, maybe 8 feet deep, invisible from ground level. He told Tully he could flank through the adjacent field, get an angle. Tully said no. Said they'd wait for mortar support. The mortar support took 40 minutes to arrive. When it did, the German gun had already displaced. They found Bianchi and Russo in the ditch. Russo was still alive, gut shot, screaming. He died before the medic arrived. Kowalski didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Everyone in the squad was thinking the same thing. They pushed east through August. The casualties mounted. Not the dramatic casualties of Omaha Beach or the bocage breakthrough. The steady, grinding casualties of defensive warfare against an enemy who understood terrain better than any American unit. The Germans didn't hold ground. They delayed. A machine gun team would kill 3 or 4 Americans, then displace before artillery arrived. Another team would open up from a different angle. The Americans advanced, but they advanced at the cost of 2 or 3 men per 100 yards. Company B started August with 187 men. By September 1st they were down to 141. 46 casualties in 30 days. Most from machine gun fire they couldn't locate until after the shooting started. Kowalski started watching how the Germans positioned their guns. They favored reverse slopes, where American observers couldn't see them until infantry crested the hill. They used dense vegetation, firing through gaps that gave them clear fields of fire while remaining concealed. They positioned guns in basements with street-level firing ports, nearly impossible to spot from outside. American doctrine was to suppress and flank, but suppressive fire only worked if you knew where to shoot. Flanking only worked if you had time and space to maneuver. In the close terrain of France and later the Hürtgen Forest, neither condition existed. The 28th Division entered the Hürtgen Forest on November 2, 1944. The forest was 70 square miles of dense pine, steep ravines and minimal roads. German forces had been preparing defenses there for 3 months. They'd registered every trail, every clearing, every approach with their artillery. They'd built bunkers, laid minefields and positioned machine guns with overlapping fields of fire. The American objective was to push through the forest to the Roar River dams. High Command estimated 3 days. It took Company B 3 days to advance 800 yards. Kowalski's squad lost 2 men in the first 20 minutes. Private Daniel Hayes from Oklahoma, killed by a mine. Private First Class Joseph Koenig from Wisconsin, killed by an MG-42 they never saw. The gun fired a 12-round burst from somewhere in the trees ahead. Koenig had been walking point. The rounds hit him across the chest and throat. He was dead before he hit the ground. The squad went flat. Staff Sergeant Tully called for smoke. The smoke rounds took 4 minutes to arrive. By the time they deployed, the German gun had displaced. They found Koenig in a drainage ditch. His body had already gone cold. That night, in a hasty defensive position half a mile into the forest, Kowalski told Tully about the hollow log idea. He'd been thinking about it since St. Lo. The forest was full of deadfall, massive logs from trees killed by previous battles or disease. Many were hollow. A man could hide inside, invisible from ground level, with angles on German positions the Germans wouldn't anticipate. Tully listened. Then he said no. Said it violated every principle of infantry tactics. Said a soldier in a log couldn't maneuver, couldn't be supported, couldn't be extracted if wounded. Said it was a good way to die alone and accomplish nothing. Kowalski pressed. Said they were dying anyway, said they were dying because they couldn't see the machine guns until after the shooting started, said his way would let them get behind German positions without being detected. Tully cut him off. Said the conversation was over. Said if Kowalski went into any logs, Tully would personally court-martial him for disobeying orders. Kowalski said nothing more. The next day, November 4th, Company B lost 9 men pushing through a quarter-mile of forest. 7 were killed by machine gun fire. 2 were killed by tree bursts, artillery shells that detonated in the canopy and rained shrapnel down. One of the machine gun deaths was Corporal William Barnett, from Kowalski's squad. Barnett had been in Kowalski's basic training platoon. They'd bunked next to each other for 8 weeks. Barnett was hit in the head while trying to flank an MG-42. Kowalski was 20 yards away when it happened. He heard the burst, heard Barnett scream once, then silence. They recovered Barnett's body after dark. The entire right side of his skull was gone. By November 6th, Company B had advanced 1.3 miles into the forest. They'd suffered 38 casualties. Their combat effectiveness was estimated at 62%. They were ordered to hold position and await reinforcements. During that hold, Kowalski walked the area around their defensive perimeter. He found 3 hollow logs within 300 yards. 2 were oak, 1 was pine. The oak logs were 4 feet in diameter, hollowed by fungal decay. The pine log was 5 feet in diameter, hollowed by fire damage, probably from a previous artillery barrage. All 3 had sight lines into German-controlled territory. All 3 were within 600 yards of known German positions. Kowalski brought the information to Tully. Tully said no again. This time he escalated to Captain Hendricks. Hendricks listened, then delivered a 10-minute lecture on infantry tactics. He said wars were won by combined arms and coordinated maneuver, not individual soldiers hiding in logs. He said Kowalski's idea reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern warfare functioned. He said the Germans would hear the shots, locate the position through muzzle flash or sound, and destroy it with artillery or grenades. He said it was suicidal individualism that got soldiers killed. He specifically ordered Kowalski, in front of the entire squad, to abandon the idea entirely. That night, November 7th, Kowalski lay in his foxhole and thought about Bianchi, Russo, Koenig, Barnett. He thought about the 46 casualties Company B had taken since entering the forest. He thought about the German machine guns that killed with impunity because American soldiers couldn't see them in time. He thought about Captain Hendricks's lecture on tactics and doctrine. Then he thought about his father, crushed in a lumber mill because company safety doctrine said chain inspections could wait until Monday. Doctrine was written by people who didn't do the actual work. Doctrine protected the people who wrote it, not the people who followed it. At 8:30 p.m., Kowalski told his foxhole mate, Private James Whitmore, that he was going out on a listening post. Whitmore asked if Tully had authorized it. Kowalski said yes. He took his Springfield, 6 stripper clips of ammunition, 2 canteens, 4K rations and his trench knife. He moved through the darkness toward the oak log he'd identified that afternoon. It took him 40 minutes to cover 300 yards. The forest floor was carpeted with mines and tripwires. He moved by feel, testing each step before committing weight. The log was where he remembered it, 30 yards off what had once been a trail. It was 4 feet 2 inches in diameter, 12 feet long, oriented east-west. The interior had been hollowed by carpenter ants and fungal decay. The opening was on the north side, a 2-foot gap where the rot had breached the shell. Kowalski crawled inside. The interior smelled like damp earth and decomposition. The wood was soft enough to carve with his knife. He spent 20 minutes cutting 2 firing ports, each 3 inches wide, 2 inches tall, positioned at ground level on the south and east faces. He packed the debris into gaps in the log's interior. Then he settled into position, Springfield ready, and waited. The log's interior was cramped. Kowalski was 5'10". He had to lie on his side with his knees bent to fit. The rotting wood was damp against his uniform. He could feel insects moving in the debris around him. His breath condensed in the cold air, but the vapor dissipated before it could exit the firing ports. He checked his sight lines. Through the south port, he had visibility on a trail intersection 200 yards away. Through the east port, he had visibility on a clearing the Germans had been using for supply movement. Both areas were beyond the range where his squad could provide covering fire. Both were locations where German soldiers moved with confidence, believing they were safe behind their own lines. At 10:15 p.m., 4 German soldiers crossed the trail intersection carrying ammunition cans. Kowalski watched them through his port. They were talking, not maintaining noise discipline. One was smoking. They disappeared into the forest. At 11:40 p.m., a German patrol passed within 20 yards of Kowalski's log. 6 men moving south toward the American lines. Their point man's boot came within 5 feet of Kowalski's firing port. Kowalski didn't move. He barely breathed. The patrol passed. None of them looked down. None of them saw the carved firing ports in the log's side. Soldiers didn't look for threats at ground level. They looked ahead into the trees, toward the enemy they expected to see standing. At 1:30 a.m., Kowalski heard sounds of digging from the clearing. He angled his view through the east port. Germans were constructing a machine gun position, piling logs and earth into a defensive barrier. He counted 8 men working. They had a flashlight, dim red lens, shielded from the south but visible from Kowalski's angle. They worked for 90 minutes. By 3 a.m., they'd completed a position that would dominate the approach route. Company B was scheduled to advance along later that morning. The gun they placed was an MG-42. Kowalski could see its distinctive barrel silhouette. At dawn, 6:10 a.m., 2 German soldiers manned the gun. Others had pulled back, probably to a rest area 50 yards behind the position. The gunner and loader were visible, heads and shoulders above the log barrier. Standard doctrine would be to call in artillery, suppress the position, then assault with infantry. But artillery required observation, and no American observer could see this position without exposing himself to fire from other German positions. Infantry assault would push straight into the MG-42's field of fire. Company B would lose men taking this position. Maybe 5. Maybe 10. Kowalski thought about Barnett. About Koenig. About Bianchi and Russo. At 6:50 a.m., the German gunner stood to stretch. He was fully exposed above the log barrier. Range was 190 yards. Kowalski adjusted for elevation, led by 6 inches for wind. He fired. The sound of the Springfield inside the hollow log was muffled, bass-heavy, muted by the surrounding earth and deadfall. The gunner dropped. The loader spun, searching for the source of the shot. He looked south. He looked up into the trees. He didn't look down. Kowalski chambered another round. The loader was still scanning when Kowalski shot him through the side of the head. 2 Germans dead. No alarm raised. That was when Kowalski realized the full tactical potential of his method. The shots didn't sound like shots from this angle. The muzzle flash was absorbed by the log's interior. There was no visual signature, no obvious source. The Germans didn't know where the fire originated. At 7:15 a.m., 4 more Germans arrived at the machine gun position. They found the bodies. They scanned the woods to the south toward the American lines. They called out, probably for a medic or officer. 1 used a radio. 2 took cover behind the logs. 2 remained exposed, trying to understand what had happened. Kowalski shot 1 through the chest. He worked the bolt and shot the second before he could react. The 2 behind cover started firing wildly south, toward the American positions 600 yards away. They thought they were under attack from that direction. Kowalski waited. One of them raised his head to observe. Kowalski shot him through the temple. The last German broke cover and ran north. Kowalski tracked him, led by 3 feet, and fired. The German fell forward and didn't move. 6 Germans dead in 20 minutes. The survivors in the area were now alert, but they were alert to the wrong threat. They reinforced positions facing south. They called in artillery on the American lines. Kowalski heard the shells screaming overhead, impacting somewhere behind him. The Germans were shelling their own forward area, trying to suppress an attack that wasn't coming. At 8 a.m., a German officer arrived with 10 soldiers. He was pointing south, giving orders, deploying his men into defensive positions facing the American lines. Kowalski had clear shots on 7 of them. He took them methodically. 1 shot, worked the bolt, acquire the next target, 1 shot. He killed 5 before the others understood they were being fired on from somewhere other than the south. They dove for cover. 1 raised binoculars and scanned the forest. He swept past Kowalski's log twice. He didn't see the firing ports. Ground-level slits in a rotting log weren't what soldiers looked for. He was searching for a sniper in a tree, a rifleman behind cover, something recognizable as a threat. The officer was shouting orders. The remaining 4 soldiers were firing in multiple directions, confused, panicked. Kowalski shot the officer first. He dropped behind a log and didn't reappear. Kowalski waited. The 4 soldiers were suppressing in 3 different directions. 1 fired east. 1 fired south. 2 fired into the canopy. None fired toward Kowalski's log. He shot them one by one as they exposed themselves to reposition. It took 8 minutes. When it was finished, 15 Germans were dead in the clearing. Kowalski had fired 23 rounds. 8 had missed due to targets moving or taking cover. His hit rate was 65%. The Germans sent no more soldiers to that position. They didn't understand what had happened there. From their perspective, an American sniper had somehow infiltrated deep behind their lines, killed 15 men, and disappeared without being located. They pulled back their forward positions by 50 yards. They called in artillery on the area, but Kowalski was 300 yards away by then, moving toward a second log he'd identified. By 2:17 p.m. on November 8th, Kowalski had been in his second log for 3 hours. This one was a pine log hollowed by fire, positioned overlooking another trail intersection. He'd carved 3 firing ports, giving him coverage in 3 directions. He'd consumed 1 K-ration and half a canteen. His legs were completely numb. Small ants were crawling across his hands and face. He didn't brush them away. Movement drew attention. Stillness was invisibility. A German supply column appeared at 2:45 p.m. 8 soldiers escorting a horse-drawn cart loaded with ammunition. They were moving slowly, cautiously, aware that something had happened earlier but not understanding what. Kowalski let them enter the intersection. He shot the lead soldier, then the rear soldier, trapping the column between bodies. The others abandoned the cart and scattered into the forest. Kowalski tracked them through his firing ports. He killed 3 more before they reached cover. The remaining 3 didn't return. The cart sat abandoned in the intersection, loaded with ammunition the Germans couldn't retrieve without exposing themselves to fire from an enemy they couldn't locate. At 4 p.m., a German patrol approached from the north. 6 men in combat formation, weapons ready, moving tactically. They'd been briefed on the earlier deaths. They were scanning constantly, watching the trees, checking their flanks. Their discipline was excellent. But they never looked down. Kowalski shot the point man at 30 yards. The patrol went flat. They were shouting directions, coordinating fields of fire. Kowalski shot the patrol leader next, identifiable by his map case. The others began suppressive fire toward the American lines. Kowalski shot 2 more before they adjusted. The last 2 broke contact and retreated north, dragging 1 wounded man. At 5:30 p.m., with daylight fading, Kowalski counted his ammunition. He'd started with 60 rounds. He had 19 remaining. He'd killed 27 Germans confirmed, possibly 4 more wounded who'd been dragged away. His body was cramped, dehydrated, exhausted. His right thumb was bleeding where he'd cut it on the bolt during rapid fire. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the November cold. The log's interior smelled like urine and rotting wood. He needed to extract before full darkness, when movement through the forest became impossible. He waited until 6:15 p.m., full dark, then crawled from the log. His legs wouldn't support him. He lay on the forest floor for 5 minutes, forcing circulation back into his calves and feet. When he could stand, he moved south toward Company B's lines. It took 90 minutes to cover 600 yards. He stepped on a tripwire at one point, heard the click of a mechanism, froze. The mine didn't detonate. Either it was a dud or he'd been light enough on the wire that the trigger hadn't fully engaged. He stood motionless for 3 minutes, then slowly lifted his boot. The wire remained taut. He moved on. He reached Company B's perimeter at 7:50 p.m. The sentry challenged him. Kowalski gave the password. The sentry, Private Whitmore, his foxhole mate, said, "Jesus Christ, Kowalski, where the hell have you been?" Kowalski said he'd been on a listening post. Whitmore said Tully was going to kill him. Kowalski said nothing. He made his way to the company CP, reported to Tully. Tully demanded to know where he'd been for 24 hours. Kowalski said he'd been observing German positions. Tully asked what he'd observed. Kowalski said he'd observed approximately 30 German casualties. Tully stared at him. "You killed 30 Germans?" Kowalski said he'd estimated 30. Tully asked how. Kowalski said from concealment. Tully asked what kind of concealment. Kowalski said a hollow log. Tully's expression changed. He called Captain Hendricks. Hendricks arrived, listened to Kowalski's report, then demanded details. Kowalski described the positions, the timing, the method. Hendricks asked if he disobeyed direct orders. Kowalski said yes. Hendricks asked if he understood that was grounds for court-martial. Kowalski said yes. Hendricks looked at Tully. Tully looked at Kowalski. Nobody spoke for 10 seconds. Finally Hendricks said, "Show me the logs." At 8:30 p.m. with two-man security, Kowalski led Hendricks and Tully back to the first log. They crawled inside one at a time. Hendricks examined the firing ports, tested the sight lines, asked about muzzle signature and sound. Kowalski explained that the log's interior absorbed most of the muzzle flash and muted the report. Hendricks asked about extraction under fire. Kowalski admitted he hadn't planned for that. Hendricks said that was why the method violated doctrine. Then he said, "But it worked." They returned to the company CP at 10 p.m. Hendricks told Kowalski he wasn't going to file court-martial paperwork. He also wasn't going to authorize the tactic officially. If Kowalski wanted to keep using logs, that was between Kowalski and God. If it got him killed, Hendricks would write in the report that Kowalski had disobeyed orders. If it kept working, Hendricks would consider revising his opinion. Kowalski said he understood. Hendricks told him to get some sleep. The next morning, November 9th, Company B advanced along the route that would have taken them directly into the MG-42 position Kowalski had eliminated. They found the bodies. 15 Germans, killed by rifle fire, most shot from angles that didn't correspond to any American position. The company medic, Corporal Hayes, examined the wounds. He said they were all high-velocity rifle rounds, consistent with a Springfield. He said the shooter had been firing from somewhere low, maybe prone, because the entry angles were slightly upward. He couldn't explain how a prone shooter had fired from multiple directions without being detected. Word spread. By noon, every man in Company B knew Kowalski had killed 30 Germans from inside a log. By evening, platoon leaders from other companies were asking Tully for details. Tully referred them to Kowalski. Kowalski explained the method. Find a hollow log, carve firing ports, position for overlapping fields of fire behind enemy lines, wait. Shoot targets of opportunity. Displace before the enemy locates you. Lieutenant Jack Morrison from Company C asked if Kowalski had tried it more than once. Kowalski said twice. Morrison asked if he'd been detected either time. Kowalski said no. Morrison asked if he could try it. Kowalski said he didn't see why not. Morrison tried it on November 11th. He found a hollow oak log 400 yards behind German lines, carved firing ports, waited. He killed 8 Germans in 6 hours, including a machine gun team that had been harassing Company C for 3 days. He extracted without being located. That night he told his squad leaders about the method. By November 13th, 7 soldiers from the 110th Infantry Regiment were using hollow logs as concealed firing positions. By November 15th, the method had spread to the 109th Infantry Regiment. Nobody called it a tactic. Nobody wrote it in reports. It was just something riflemen did in the Hürtgen Forest, passed by word of mouth, demonstrated by example. The results were impossible to ignore. German casualties in the 28th Division sector increased by 38% between November 8th and November 20th. American casualties from machine gun fire decreased by 22% in the same period. The Germans noticed. Their tactical reports from mid-November referenced unusual American sniper activity and fire from unexpected angles. A report from the 275th Infantry Division, dated November 18, noted that American riflemen appeared to be infiltrating to flanking positions without detection, and recommended increased vigilance on rear areas. On November 21, Oberstleutnant Klaus Berger, commanding officer of a German Kampfgruppe in the Hürtgen sector, was killed by rifle fire while inspecting forward positions. Witnesses reported a single shot, no visible shooter. Berger's aide, Lieutenant Franz Keitel, survived and later wrote in his diary, "The Americans have learned to hunt us from the forest floor." Berger was killed by a ghost. No muzzle flash. No sound beyond the shot itself. Our men searched for 30 minutes and found nothing but trees and logs. Keitel's diary was captured in March 1945, during the Rhine crossing. American intelligence analysts read it with interest but couldn't correlate the ghost reference to any specific tactic. The hollow log method had never been officially documented. It existed only as field practice, taught soldier to soldier, refined through trial and error. The German response was psychological before it was tactical. By late November, German soldiers in the Hürtgen Forest were reporting increased fear of American snipers. They moved more cautiously. They avoided trails and clearings. They reduced their use of forward observation posts. These behavioral changes degraded their defensive effectiveness. A defender who fears unseen threats is a defender who hesitates, and hesitation in combat creates opportunities. By December 1944, the hollow log method had been adopted by elements of the 4th Infantry Division and the 8th Infantry Division, both fighting in the Hürtgen Forest. It was never formalized. No training manual was written. No after-action report detailed the tactic. But soldiers talked. They shared what worked. A rifleman from the 4th Division would rotate to a rest area, meet a rifleman from the 28th Division, hear about the log method, try it himself. That rifleman would tell his squad. His squad would tell their platoon. The method spread through the informal network that connects soldiers who share danger. Total confirmed kills attributed to hollow log tactics between November 8 and December 16, 1944. 214 Germans. Conservative estimate based on company-level casualty reports and witness statements collected post-war. The actual number was likely higher, but many kills were never documented. A rifleman operating alone behind enemy lines didn't always report his results. Sometimes he just came back and the German positions were weaker the next day and nobody asked detailed questions. The official response came in February 1945. A staff officer from V Corps headquarters, Major Edward Simmons, was tasked with investigating the unusually high German casualty rates in the Hürtgen sector relative to American losses. Simmons interviewed 40 soldiers from 3 divisions. 32 mentioned the hollow log method. 19 had used it personally. Simmons requested a demonstration. Private First Class Eugene Kowalski, by then promoted to corporal, provided it. Simmons watched Kowalski enter a log, carve firing ports and demonstrate sight lines. He asked about vulnerability to artillery. Kowalski said artillery was a risk, but German artillery couldn't target what they couldn't locate. Simmons asked about grenades. Kowalski said grenades required the enemy to know where you were. Simmons asked about extraction under fire. Kowalski said you extracted before the enemy located you, or you didn't extract at all. Simmons wrote in his report, "This method represents a significant tactical innovation developed by enlisted personnel without officer guidance. It violates conventional doctrine regarding fields of fire, mutual support and command control. It is also extraordinarily effective in densely wooded terrain against an enemy expecting conventional tactics." Simmons recommended the method be incorporated into infantry training for forest warfare. His recommendation was filed and forgotten. The war in Europe ended 3 months later. The Hürtgen Forest was no longer relevant. The hollow log method disappeared with the men who'd used it. Kowalski received no commendation for his innovation. His personnel file noted his promotion to corporal in January 1945, his award of the Bronze Star for Valor in March 1945, and his discharge in November 1945. The Bronze Star citation referenced exceptional courage under fire, but didn't specify what he'd done. The hollow log method wasn't mentioned. As far as the official record was concerned, it had never existed. Kowalski returned to Stevenson, Michigan in December 1945. He found work at a sawmill, the same company his father had worked for. He married in 1947. He had 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war. When pressed, he'd say he'd been a rifleman in the 28th Division, that he'd served in France and Germany, that he'd been lucky to come home. He never mentioned the logs. He never mentioned the 52 Germans he'd killed from that first oak log on November 8, 1944. It wasn't modesty. It was that the war had been full of men doing extraordinary things under terrible conditions, and Kowalski didn't think his actions were particularly extraordinary. He'd seen a problem, improvised a solution and survived. Thousands of men had done the same. In 1978, a military historian named Dr. Robert was researching small unit tactics in the Hürtgen Forest. He interviewed veterans from the 28th Division. 3 mentioned the hollow log method. Was skeptical. It sounded implausible. He asked for documentation. None existed. He asked for names. They gave him Kowalski's. Wrote to Kowalski, asked for an interview. Kowalski declined. Drove to Stevenson, found Kowalski at the sawmill, asked again. Kowalski said there wasn't much to tell. Asked if he'd really killed 52 Germans from one log in one day. Kowalski said he'd counted 52 bodies when his company advanced through that area, so probably yes. Asked why the method had never been documented. Kowalski said because Captain Hendricks had explicitly forbidden it, and even after it worked, nobody wanted to admit they'd achieved results by ignoring orders. Asked if the method had been taught post-war. Kowalski said not to his knowledge. Asked if that bothered him. Kowalski said no. The war was over. The forest was gone, burned or logged. The tactics that worked there wouldn't work elsewhere. What bothered him was that people kept asking about it like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever done. It wasn't. It was just something that worked in a bad situation. Ehrlich published his findings in a 1981 academic journal article titled, Improvised Tactics in the Hürtgen Forest, the Hollow Log Method. The article received minimal attention. It was cited in 3 subsequent works on small unit tactics, all of which treated the method as a historical curiosity rather than a viable technique. Modern infantry doctrine emphasizes mobility, combined arms and technological superiority. Concealment in static positions is considered obsolete. The hollow log method, which required patience, fieldcraft and willingness to operate alone behind enemy lines, didn't fit contemporary tactical frameworks. But doctrine follows context. The hollow log method worked in the Herkin Forest because the forest created conditions where conventional tactics failed. Dense vegetation limited observation. Overlapping German machine gun positions created kill zones. American artillery support was degraded by tree bursts and limited visibility. In that specific context, a lone rifleman in a hollow log could accomplish what a platoon using standard tactics could not. The method wasn't obsolete. The forest that necessitated it was. Kowalski died in 1996, age 75, from complications of emphysema. His obituary in the Stevenson Sentinel noted his service in World War II, his 48 years at the sawmill, his 3 children, 8 grandchildren. It didn't mention the hollow log method. It didn't mention the 214 confirmed German casualties attributed to the tactic he'd invented. His funeral was attended by 70 people. None were military historians. Conservative estimates credit the hollow log method with saving between 40 and 60 American lives during the Hürtgen Forest campaign. The method enabled American units to eliminate German machine gun positions without frontal assault, reducing casualties during advances. It disrupted German defensive coordination by creating uncertainty about American infiltration capabilities. It forced German units to divert resources to rear security, degrading their forward combat power. These effects compounded over 6 weeks of combat, creating operational advantages that standard tactics could not achieve. The method's legacy isn't in training manuals or tactical doctrine. It's in the principle Kowalski demonstrated, that innovation in combat often comes from soldiers who see problems their commanders don't, who improvise solutions their training didn't teach, who act despite regulations forbidding it. Wars aren't won by commanders following doctrine. They're won by privates who understand that doctrine is a starting point, not a limitation, and who possess the courage to improvise when doctrine fails. That's how wars are actually fought. Not through plans written in headquarters, but through solutions discovered in forests and fields by men under fire. Not through authorization from officers, but through initiative from soldiers who understand that asking permission means watching friends die. The hollow log method saved lives because Eugene Kowalski, a sawmill worker from Michigan, refused to accept that 52 Germans needed to die before anyone questioned why American tactics weren't working. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.